The story of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem on the Sunday before his crucifixion, as told in the Gospel of Matthew, is a story of subversion. But it's a subversion that takes place on two levels. At the first and perhaps most obvious level, Jesus is portrayed as acting in a very provocative way. A way that was clearly intended to subvert the claims and assertions of the privileged and powerful of his day. You see, when a general or a king or an emperor entered a city, there was always a parade. At the head of the parade rode the general or king or emperor on a war horse, or perhaps he was in a chariot, and behind him marched row after row of grim-faced soldiers. The more powerful the man leading the parade, the more numerous were the soldiers who followed him, and therefore the longer the parade. For it was those soldiers who were both the source and guarantor of that leader's power. For the people of a subject city like Jerusalem, the parade that accompanied the arrival of the Roman governor and his army just before the celebration of the Passover must have been a galling sight indeed. For just as they were about to celebrate God's great act of liberation in delivering their ancestors from slavery in Egypt, the arrival of the Roman army of occupation, led by the Roman governor, must have been a starkly humiliating reminder that they were once again enslaved people. Now, some scholars have suggested that Jesus timed his entry into the city of Jerusalem to coincide with that of Pilate and his army. The Romans, of course, would have entered by the main gate. Pilate would have led the parade mounted on a war horse, and the people of the city who lined the sides of the road would have kept a sullen silence as they were forced to watch their oppressor display his military power in a way that implied the threat of blood and violence that would surely follow any attempt to challenge that power. On the other side of the city, Jesus led another parade, riding a donkey mare whose foal trotted along beside them, a less warlike image it's impossible to imagine, rather than a war horse, entered Jerusalem. And the crowd who followed him, and those who witnessed his coming, were full of joy rather than despair and sorrow. Their faces were cheerful rather than sullen. Everything about Jesus entering to Jerusalem subverted the way power is attained and exercised in our world. Jesus came proclaiming and embodying a kingdom that challenged and undermined the kingdoms of this world. He came exercising a power that, from the perspective of the Roman Empire, and indeed of the empires of our world as well, looked a lot like powerlessness, but which would be revealed as the ultimate power, the power of love and justice and peace. Jesus' triumphal entry was, from the perspective of the powerful and privileged, a subversive act. One of many such acts of Jesus. And it was these acts, these subversive acts, that led the powerful and privileged to seek to find a way to destroy him. As the theologian Stanley Hauerhaus has put it, Jesus wasn't crucified because he told people to love one another. He was crucified because by word and deed he challenged the powerful and privileged of his time. But the triumphal entry of Jesus into the city of Jerusalem was also subversive on another level, because it subverted not only the power structures of the world, but also it subverted the expectations of Jesus' own followers. The celebrations that surrounded Jesus entering into Jerusalem reveal the nature of the hopes and expectations of those who were doing the celebrating. They hailed Jesus as the Son of David, that is, as the one who is entitled to sit upon the throne of Israel. And they expected that he had come in the name of God, empowered by God, to lead a glorious uprising that would drive out the Romans and establish a new kingdom of Israel over which Jesus would reign. Hosanna, they cried. The word means save us. What they meant was, save us from our oppressor, deliver us from bondage, lift the burden of shame and humiliation, save us. Indeed, Jesus had come to save, but not in the way that they hoped or expected. He came riding on a female donkey, a foal gambolling along beside them. He came armed only with love, compassion, and faith in God. He came to save, indeed, to save the people of Jerusalem, to save even the Roman oppressors, and to save us as well, to save us from despair and violence and hatred, to save us and liberate us from the ultimate power that oppresses us all. He had come to save us from the power of death itself. He had come to defeat death and everything that is deathly and death-dealing in this world, all cruelty and pride and violence and greed. He had come to overcome the death-dealing power of sin. He'd come to save them and to save us from death, not by leading an uprising, but by dying. Dying so that, having died, he might be raised again to bring new life. So you see, the expectations of that celebrating crowd were being subverted as well. One of the points that Matthew makes in his account, by spending so much time focusing upon the acquisition of the donkey and the foal, is to show that the events that were taking place were in fulfillment of ancient prophecy, and as such were expressions of God's plan and purpose. God had sent Jesus to liberate God's people, to set us all free, but to liberate us in a way we never expected, and to give us a freedom we would never dare hope for. On that day, as Jesus rode down the hill from the Mount of Olives, surrounded by the cheering, singing crowd, things were not as they seemed. The people saw one thing, but God had something far greater in mind. God bless you all. I want to conclude by reading a poem. And the poem is written by a woman named Jan Richardson, who is an artist, a minister, and a poet. The poem is called Blessing of Palms. This blessing can be heard coming. Let me begin again. This blessing can be heard coming from a long way off. This blessing is making its steady way up the road toward you. This blessing blooms in the throats of women, springs from the hearts of men, tumbles out of the mouths of children. This blessing is stitched into the seams of the cloaks that line the road, etched into the branches that trace the path, echoes in the breathing of the willing colt, the click of the donkey's hoof against the stones. Something is rising beneath this blessing. Something will try to drown it out. But this blessing cannot be turned back, cannot be made to still its voice, cannot cease to sing its praise of the one who comes along the way it makes. Amen.